Hello, welcome. We'll start with class 10 political science, the very first chapter that talks about power sharing. Now, as we had talked about in class 9th lectures, class 10th lectures are a continuation for class 9. So, if you have a good fundamental base of class 9, class 10 chapters become very easy. This applies both to political science and history. So, make sure you have a good revision and a good command over the class 9th lectures so as to follow the class 10th lectures carefully. Now, this first topic about power sharing is very simple to understand. Let's take a case study of a school. What happens in a school is you have a kind of hierarchy that we can say. So you have principal that looks after the whole of the school. Then you have section in charge. So let's say the primary section, the middle section, the higher section and the higher secondary section. So those are the various in charge. Then within these primary you would have each and every section would have class teachers. So that's a kind of hierarchy. What is happening here is the power is being shared between the different sections of the school. So you have principal that holds the maximum power, then you have the section in charge and finally the respective class teachers. Similar to this setup that occurs in a school or any other body that you might be familiar with, we have this power sharing that occurs at a national level. Now this power sharing could be classified under four basic terms or four basic categories, we should say, that we would understand later. For now, let's take two interesting case examples. One is from Belgium and the other is from Sri Lanka. Now both of these studies would help us understand the idea of power sharing, but that would be in a kind of different manner. Now Belgium is a very small nation, smaller than we can say the state of Haryana in India. Now if you look onto the map of Belgium, you would have the French speaking population that resides in Wallonia and that accounts for nearly 40% of the population. In contrast to that, you have the Dutch speaking population in the Flemish area. You have 59% Dutch speakers. So overall, if you look onto the global picture, and 1% here would be the people who speak German. Now overall, if you look onto the picture of Belgium, the predominant population in Belgium is Dutch speaking, but an interesting contrast exists in the capital of Brussels. Now what happens in the capital of Brussels is you have only 20% people who are Dutch speaking and 80% people who are French speaking. So what happens within the country and within the capital is different. Now to maintain this balance, there were numerous amendments that were released between 1970s to 1993, and of these four basic amendments, the final declaration we should say that came out was that each and every speaking language should have an equal representation in the government. So that was the idea that was released in Belgium. Now because of this, Belgium prospered, we can say, and as of now Belgium is the headquarters for European Union. Now in Belgium you had the community government that was established. Community government means the government based on or the group of organization that's based on the language. Now based on the language you had the community government that was established, which included Dutch, French and German speaking people. All of these were given kind of representation in the government. Now as we said, Belgium has a peaceful history, we can say, because each and every linguistic group was given a proper representation in the government. Since they had a proper representation in the government, the things got much smoother. Now let's talk about a contrast study where you have a majority government that was in power, and because of that majority government, you had the idea of majoritarianism. That means the government in power would have more rules and would give special preference to that sect. Now what happens in Sri Lanka is, if you look onto the map of Sri Lanka again, you have nearly 74% of the people who are Buddhist speaking. So this whole region, you have the Sinhalese population and you have 74% who are speaking Buddhist, and of the remaining you have 18% which are Tamil speakers. Within the Tamil speakers you have the Sri Lankan Tamils and the Indian Tamils. Now these Sri Lankan and Indian Tamils have their own representation. Besides this, you have 7% Christians that are seen, and these 7% Christians are both Tamils as well as Sinhalese. Now, within the Tamil, as we said, you have the Sri Lankan Tamil and the Indian Tamil. Sri Lankan Tamil account for nearly 13% of the population, located mainly in the northern and the eastern areas, and the Indian Tamils are those people whose forefathers came to Sri Lanka during the colonial period. So those are the case of Sri Lanka. Now when it got independence in 1948, what happened was Sinhalese were in majority and they came to power. Now when you had a kind of Sinhalese government that was in power, they were against the Tamilians, and as a result the Tamilians felt much more aggrieved and they were demanding a separate Tamilelam state. Now because you had Sinhalese who were in majority and won the power, they declared certain educational institutions to have special seats or special reservations for Buddhist speaking people. They declared Buddhist as their official language. So there was a kind of huge preferential politics, we could say, that started to develop in Sri Lanka. So as we can see, the state of Belgium and the country of Belgium and Sri Lanka witnessed power sharing, but they had the different routes for the power sharing. In Belgium it was more peaceful, more systematic and more a kind of generalized view of the people, because as we saw at the national level you had Dutch as a majority, but at the capital Dutch were minority. So they said that be it the national level or be it the city level, we would have equal representations for both the all the speakers residing there. So finally what happened was, the people in the capital city as well as people in the country were happy, but this was not the case for Sri Lanka, where you had Tamil and Sinhalese who were at constant war with one another, leading to civil wars that came up, which led many of the people to refugees, and finally it was a setback for the common people residing there. Now as we said, power sharing becomes important because if you are controlling a bigger area, it's practically not possible for one person to look after the entire region. So definitely at every level you would have power sharing that would occur. Now this power sharing could be prudential as well as moral. Now these two terms are very important, specifically for your questions. What is a difference between a prudential power and a moral power? When we talk about prudential power, we focus more on the outcomes. So let's say we are sharing the power. So will the conflicts come down? Will there be more stability in the political setup? Will the majority not undermine the rights of minority? So those are the kinds of judgments that come under prudential powers. When we are talking about moral outcomes, we emphasize that act of power sharing is more valuable. So we are not focusing on the outcomes right now. Under prudential, we focus or we check out the gains and the losses. So how much benefit would I have if I use this idea of power sharing, and what would be the negative consequences that we could face. However, in moral, we just talk about whether this idea is valuable and how very valuable. So we talk about a good spirit of democracy. We talk about that people must have rights which should be consulted with how they are governed. So people having more rights having a spirit of democracy is the sole idea under the moral behavior. Now coming on to the forms of power sharing. As we said, we would be focusing on 4 different forms of power sharing. The very first form is the horizontal form of power sharing. In the class 9th lectures, we have talked about 3 pillars of the government. So you have judiciary, executive and legislature. Legislature forms the law, executive executes it, and judiciary resolves any kind of dispute that occurs between them. Now since these are the 3 pillars, this judiciary has its own checks and balances. That means if legislature or executive have some powers or some rules that have come up, this judiciary has a power to check it as and when required. So that's one of the most interesting feature that you have under the horizontal distribution of power. Again, with the horizontal distribution of power, you have much more dispersal of power that occurs during the emergency purposes. And a good example that has been mentioned in NCERT is the Bombay High Court ordered the Maharashtra government to take an action to improve the living conditions of 2000 odd children homes in Mumbai. So that's a kind of horizontal distribution of power. The next is the federal government. Now this federal government and federalism would be our next chapter, the second chapter in the political science that we would be discussing again. Now what happens in the federal government? Under the federal government, you have 2 forms. So you have a center and a state. So let's say you have India here. So one would be the government that would be ruling the whole of the country, and the other would be the government that would be ruling the individual states. Now these states are being ruled by the state government, and then you have certain decisions which are coming up under the central government. So you have 2 forms of federal governments coming together, federalism and holding together. We will be talking about coming together and holding together federalism in the next lecture. So where we will be discussing class 2. So that again becomes important. The third form of power sharing is the community government. Community government is a classic example as we saw in the case of Belgium. So what happens is certain minority groups, certain languages are given power so as to represent themselves or have their say. Let's say we provide reservation to certain communities so that they can have their own say or stake. So in the last class, in class 9th, we talked about reserved constituencies. So under reserved constituencies, what happens is there is a government that is in majority, and we try to focus on improving the scenario of that region by electing a representative who belongs to that community. So that's what is a kind of community government that we talk about. And similarly, a good example is the Ontario example from Canada, where the minister announced the government to work with the tribal peoples or the aboriginal peoples. The next is the coalition government. Now coalition government is another very interesting aspect. Let's talk about the center. You have 5 parties that are contesting an election. Now what happens is you have party A, B, C, D and E, and let's say there are 500 seats. In the first case, party A gets 300 seats. So we can say party A is in majority, and even if all other parties unite together, they would have only 200 seats. So they cannot have a say in the government, and finally party A is elected to power. So this becomes a kind of unitary government where single government would be at power. However, there would be a case where, let's say you have 100 seats for this, 80, 80, 80, so 80, 80, 80, you have 240, 340 and 160. So you have these number of seats that are there for each party. Now what would happen is, you would say that okay, certain party, even if they come together, there would be at least 3 parties that should come together to form a majority, more than 50%. So these parties, let's say A, B, C, join together to form a majority government, and when you have more than 2 parties that come together to form a government, we call it a coalition government. So this is an example of a coalition government. So So under coalition government, you have an example from Russia where you have the union of right forces and the liberal movement that united together to form the right-wing coalition. Similarly, you had the VP Singh's government in India. That was a good example of coalition government. Till then, we did not witness numerous coalition governments in India. So, 4 types of power sharings we have talked about. The horizontal distribution of power, which talks about the 3 pillars, the legislative, executive and the judiciary. Then you have power sharing based on the federal structure. So, you have federal government, the powers divided between the center and the state. The next we came across was the community government, and the last was the coalition government. As we promised in the previous chapters, we will be discussing some important questions. So, the first important question would be, what is the difference between prudential and moral power sharing basis, and why power sharing is desirable? So, these 2 questions are important. Then you have the next question, what are the various forms of power sharing? What is a coalition government? What is a difference between a community government and a coalition government? So, all those topics we have discussed. Whenever you are writing your answers, you can substantiate the answers and the concepts with examples, so that would give the answers a good weightage. Welcome. We'll start with the second chapter for political science, where we would talk about federalism. Now, in the last chapter of political science, we have talked about 4 different types of power sharing. The one was the horizontal distribution of power. The second was the idea of federal structure of the government. The third was the community government, and the fourth was the coalition government. So, we will focus on federalism for now. As we talked about in the last class, federalism talks about division of power between center and the state. So, let's say we have numerous issues that we need to discuss about. It can be defense, it can be agriculture, it can be education, so on and so forth. So, what we do is, we decide, okay, let's say defense would be looked after by the center, agriculture would be looked after by the state, and so on. So, what happens is, the ruling becomes much more easy, the execution process becomes much more efficient. So, that's the sole idea under the structure of federalism. We saw in Belgium how the unitary form of the government slowly and gradually, after amendments between 1970 to 1993, shifted to a kind of federal structure where equal representations were given to both the states or both the linguistic groups. Similarly, under federal structure, what we do is, let's say central government would have so and so powers, state government would have so and so powers. We usually say that state government would look after the day-to-day functioning, the day-to-day administration at the local level, at the state level. However, center has much fewer subjects of more importance. However, the idea of federalism differs from state to state and country to country. So, later on in this section, we would be focusing specifically on India. Let's first talk about the idea of federalism and the benefits. So, if we look onto the world map, here out of the 192 states, you have 25 nations that have federal structure of the government, and these contribute to 40% of the population worldwide. So, that's definitely a huge amount, and mostly, as you can see, bigger nations who are bigger in size, bigger in dimensions, usually have a federal structure, so that the ruling becomes, or the execution of power becomes much more efficient and better. Now, what are the basic features of federalism? First of all, as we said, there would be division of power between the center and the state. Now, taxes would be collected, or revenue we should say would be collected separately at the state level and the center level, or if it's collected at one level, it would be divided for the center and the state in certain ratio or certain amount. Each body, the center and the state, would have their own jurisdictions. So, let's talk about India. So, let's say in India, at the national level, you would have Supreme Court. At the state level, you would have High Court. So, that's the kind of jurisdiction that would be seen at each and every level. If there is requirement for the fundamental change in the constitutional provisions, both the center and the state should have their say and should have their yes basically to make that change in the constitution ultimately. It brings in more unity tries to protect the regional diversity of each and every region and maintains a mutual trust and agreement. Now there are two basic forms of federalism that exist. This is a very, very important question. You have the coming together federalism and holding together federalism. In coming together federalism, we say you have independent states that are there and they try to maintain their own identity and sovereignty and increase their security by coming together. That could be seen in the nations of Australia, Switzerland and America. So all the states have equal power. They are as strong as the federal government. But in India, this is not the case. In India, we have a holding together federalism. Holding together federalism implies that the country is divided into states, but the center would allot the center would divide the powers between the state and the center. So that's a basic difference between the coming together federalism and a holding together federalism. So let's talk about, for example, America. You have coming together federalism. So each of the state, be it the state of California, be it the state of New York or Oregon, each would have their own government and own constitution. However, when we talk about holding together federalism, as in India, you have the center which is much stronger than the respective state governments, and it would basically try to divide powers or say that okay, state should need to look after these and these issues. So those two types of federal governments or federation are really very important to understand. Now let's come on to India. That's the major section that we would be talking about, or the major study that we would be doing. Now in India, we have division of powers at 3 levels. All the powers that reside with the center are known as the union list or the central powers or the powers with the central government. The next is the powers that you have with the state that fall under the state list, and some of the powers are equally divided between the center and the state, and those goes to the concurrent list. So that's the division of power. Now coming on to the division of the government. At the center you have the central government, then you have the state which has the state government, and then you have the local government. So local government can be RLG or ULG, that's the rural local government or the urban local government, which came up under the 73rd and 74th Amendment Act of the Constitution. Now at the center, as we say, we have the Prime Minister, we have the President of the country, and we have the Parliament. In the state level, we have the Chief Minister, we have the Legislative Assembly and the Vidhan Sabha and the Vidhan Parishad in certain cases. So you have that occurs at the center, state level, and then at the local level you have the village panchayat, you have the panchayat samiti that we will discuss later. Now when there was the division of powers between center, state and concurrent list, what happened was, after this was done, there were certain subjects that came up. Now since these were already declared that this power or this ministry or this department would go to center, this would go to state, and so on and so forth, what would happen to the things that came after the constitution was written? For example, computer softwares. Now computer softwares was neither the part of central government nor the part of state government, because it was not a concept till the constitution came up. So finally what happened was, it was put into the residuary powers. Now residuary powers are those powers that are seen up or that are governed only by the center. So all the residuary powers are looked after by the union government, and computer software, since it came after the constitution was written, you have it lying in the residuary subjects. Now you have the list of the union list, the state list and the concurrent list, as we discussed, and some of the subjects that are, some of the departments that are part of union list, state list and concurrent list. The next important topic is, in India we say we have a federal structure which is holding together. The only state that has a separate constitution in India is Jammu Kashmir. So Jammu Kashmir has certain provisions. For example, a person who is not domiciled of that region cannot buy or sell land in that region. The next is the union territories. We say we have 29 states and 7 union territories. So those 7 union territories fall directly under the central government. They are not looked after by the state, or they do not have the powers as the states have. For any change that need to occur in any of these arrangements, what happen is both the houses must have 2/3 of the majority. So when we talk about both houses, it's Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, and then it should be ratified by the legislatures of the states with at least 50% of the people who are accepting that ratification. When it comes to judiciary, we talk about resolution of disputes, solving of problems. So under resolution of disputes, we say at the center level we have the Supreme Court. However, at the state level you have the high courts that come up. Now how do we practice federalism? Federalism is commonly seen in the democratic politics of a state or of a nation. In India, we initially started the division based on the language groups. So we had Andhra speaking people who demanded for a separate state. Then came up Marathis, Tamils, so on and so forth. So the initial division of India, after the independence, we had the division that came up on the linguistic basis. Despite that, we have certain states that are classified on the basis of culture, ethnicity, or the geographical conditions of that region. For example, Nagaland, you have Jharkhand, Uttarakhand, and so on. The last state that got separated was Telangana, that became a separate state in 2014 in India. So India basically follows a language policy. So when we say language policy, we say Hindi is the official language, but for all judicial purposes, English would remain the official language or the basic language. There are 21 other languages that have been recognized in the scheduled languages of India. Now, if we look around, we have nearly 1500 distinct languages, 114 major languages, but in the category of scheduled languages that are listed on the currency notes, that are listed in the constitution, we have these 22 languages that were part of the 8th schedule. Now, Hindi is the most popular of that. 40% of the population have the first language as Hindi. If we include the people who have their second language and the third language is Hindi, it comes to nearly 50%. But when it comes to English, it's only 0.02% who have English as their first language. But English coming up or becoming the second and the third language, you have 11% of the population. So most of the things that were non-Hindi states were starting to believe that Hindi should not be the official language of a country, because if that happens, we need to have our separate existence or a separate state. So government favored these conditions, and finally there was a ruling that said that all official documents and all judicial documents would remain in English. So therefore, center-state relations become very, very important. As we saw after 1990s, we witnessed coalition governments in India. So regional parties try to come together and form a government at the center level. Till then, you had a single party that was winning the elections and was coming into power. Now, decentralization in India. So, decentralization started with the Ashok Mehta committee, where we talked about decentralization at the rural level and the urban level. So, primarily it was for the rural bodies. Under the rural areas or the rural local bodies, we have 1/3 of the seats that have been reserved for the female candidates. So power is being taken from the state to the local people. So once you have the local people who are coming into power, they have more representation, more decentralization, and more power that could be attained by them. So it became mandatory later on to hold regular elections for local bodies, to have reservation for ST, SC and women at local level, and you have the Panchayati Raj system that evolved. Now, Panchayati Raj system, what it is, it's very interesting to understand. First of all, in the Panchayati Raj system, you have the lowest level, which is the village. So, at the village, you have the Gram Panchayat that is seen. Now, this Gram Panchayat would have panchayat. So panch means 5. So you would have sarpanch and the other members of the ward which are known as panch, which would be the part of this gram panchayat. They are elected directly by the people and they take the decisions directly for the people. They approve the budget and review the performance. Above the village level, you have the Panchayat Samiti, or which is also known as the block or the mandal. It is the group of various villages coming together. So you have various villages that came together and this formed a block or a mandal or samiti. Now this samiti, the members are elected by the Panchayat members of each village. So 5 members from this, 5 from this, 5 from this, together will elect the members at the district level. They form the Zilla Parishad. Now this Zilla Parishad have their own elected members. Sometimes they can be MLAs or MPs, and then you have the Zilla Person Chairman, that's the political head of the Zilla Parishad. Similarly to the local area, the rural areas, you have the urban areas where you have municipalities. If it is a bigger urban area, you would have municipal corporations that would be seen. In the municipalities, you have the chairman, which is the head. In the municipal corporations, you have mayor, which is the head of the municipal corporations. Now, what is the institution of Zilla Parishad? As we discussed, Zilla Parishad is the political head. Now, when we say the division of power, you have the district magistrate and the Zilla Parishad. What's the difference between the role of the two? District magistrate is chaired by a non-political head. So, he is basically a civil servant or an administrative head. The decision making is done by the Zilla Parishad. The execution is done by the district magistrate. Now, the chairman of Zilla Parishad comes under the collector or the district magistrate, but above the additional collector. A good example of division of power is seen in the city of Port Alegre in Brazil. So what happened was, you had the decentralization with participative government or participative democracy that was seen in Brazil. What happened was, the different wards, the city was divided into wards or sectors, and each sector had its own meeting. So buses now run into poor colonies, and builders cannot basically have slum dwellers without resettling them. So all those developments came in the city because of the active division of power and the involvement of local people into the budget and allocation of resources, so that even the common man and the poor gets the maximum benefit out of it. Coming on to the questions from this chapter, the first important question is, what is the difference between coming together federation and holding together federation? Why India is a holding together federation? That becomes the second most important question. The third important question is, what is the characteristic feature of a federal government? The difference between a federal government and a unitary government, explained with examples. Then a very important short question or a kind of objective question is, what are residuary powers? Who looks after the residuary powers in India? And again a small question can be, what is concurrent list? Welcome, we'll talk about the 6th chapter for class 10th NCERT. Here we'll focus on the political parties. Now coming on to the very first issue, why are political parties important? So political parties are basically vehicles of federal change or federal sharing. So they act as power sharing groups. They act as a negotiator between the common man and the political setup or the government, we could say. Now when we talk about a political party, it's definitely required because 100 years back, if we look onto the phenomena, we had only few political parties, and now there are only few nations which do not have political parties. So that's the kind of change that has come over during the period of 100 years, and it's definitely there are a group of people who keep on blaming the various political parties for not achieving the standards, but on the other hand, these political parties are important because they ultimately represent people or give the opinion of the people in front of the government. So they basically bring in laws, bring in amendments, or they have a strong opposition, and that opposition pressurizes the party that's ruling to work on certain issues. So some of the important points that we talk about are political parties are definitely a group of people who come together to contest the elections with the same ideology or a same mindset, we could say. They try to persuade people why their party is good and why you should follow a certain party or a specific party. They aim to win the popular support. Now what would happen if I stand as an individual candidate? I can win an election, but when it comes to ultimately representation in the parliament or the state legislature, a one person cannot represent. So each one, if they are standing as an independent candidate, will not be able to express themselves. So what would happen is there would be a kind of political division in the society, and formation of these political parties liberalizes the issue or makes this much more easier to express their opinion or bring out a certain change. So these parties, what are their main functions? First of all, contesting the elections, forming various programs and policies for the betterment of the nation, making decisive roles or important decisions for amendment of the law or bringing in a new law, forming and running the government. The next is those who lose take part in the opposition. So a strong opposition would definitely have a pressure on the ruling party, and therefore there could not be undue changes that could be made in the parliament. Again, an idea is to shape a good public opinion and provide access to the government machinery and welfare schemes. So those are some of the major functions why political parties are important and they are required in the country. The next is, when we talk about the requirement of the political party, the few things that we take into account are, as we said, the independent candidates, even if they win, they cannot have their opinion presented in the government, because for that you need a kind of majority support, and that could be possible only if you are a part of certain political party. To support the government to make policies or bring in any kind of change, you must have a kind of representation, and that representation is brought about by political party. Now political parties could be of different types. There could be one party system where there is a single democratic party that exists or a single party that exists and rules the country. There could be only two major parties that appear. For example, in US and you have United Kingdom. So in US you have Democrats and Republicans. So just two major parties, and then you have independent candidates that stand. However, India follows a multi-party system. When we talk about a multi-party system, a basic advantage is you try or you provide a competing base for the political parties. And sometimes what happens is, let's say there are 5 political parties, A, B, C and D. Out of that you have total 50 seats. Now if Party A gets 30 seats, then you have a kind of absolute majority, and this Party A would form the government. In another case, you have 5, 10, 15 and 5 seats for the different parties that are allocated. What would happen is some of the parties would come together to form a coalition government, and that is what is commonly seen when you have a multi-party system. So you have the coalition government that takes place. In India, there have been 3 major alliances in 2004. So NDA, or the National Democratic Alliance, United Progressive Alliance and the Left Front were 3 of those. Now when the party evolves, it evolves with a long history it has. So each party has its own ideology. There was one of the study that was done recently on the state of political parties. The study revealed that political parties are the least trusted institutions in the world. However, the participation in political parties in India is much higher as compared to other nations. The proportion of people who are member of national parties or political parties have increased over the time. People do not enjoy much trust in the political organizations, and the proportion of people who are feeling themselves closely knitted or tied to a political group has increased over the time. So that's just one of the findings based on the survey. Now coming on to the types of political party. In India, we have predominantly 2 types of parties, the national party and the state party. Now the criteria to become a national party and a state party are different. So we will understand that in a while. However, each national party must register with the Election Commission of India. On registering, they would receive special facilities. They would have a kind of symbol that could be used by the official members only. which are recognized, and therefore recognition of a political party is very, very important. So the criteria to be recognized is very simple. 6% of the total votes to the legislative assemblies in at least 2 of the states would make a state party, and in at least 4 of the Lok Sabha states would make a national party, and along with that you would have a 4 seats in Lok Sabha. So that's a kind of summary. We would have a detailed criteria here. So for being a national party, a detailed criteria is getting a recognition as a state party in at least 4 of the states. In the general elections, the party must poll 6% of the votes in 4 of the states and win 4 Lok Sabha seats at least. Along with that, the party should win 2% of the seats in Lok Sabha. As of 2011, there were 11 seats from at least 3 different states. So if all these criteria are fulfilled, we say the party is considered a national party. The NCRT gives 6 as national party. However, as of 2018, we have 7 national parties that are present. The first is the Indian National Congress. This is the oldest party, established in 1885. The idea is basically secularism, welfare of the weaker section, the minority, and supporting the economic reforms. Under Jawaharlal Nehru, huge developments were brought about under the Indian National Congress. Bharatiya Janata Party or BJP is the next party, founded in 1980, a kind of recent party with the original name as Bharatiya Jan Sangh. The ideologies are territorial integration of Jammu Kashmir with India, banning the religious conversions, uniform civil code, and so those are some of the major ideas that are laid under Bharatiya Janata Party or BJP. The next is All India Trinamool Congress, founded in 98, very recently by Mamata Banerjee, with the party symbol as flower and glass. Bahujan Samaj Party, formed by Kashi Ram in 1984 after formation of BJP. The idea was to help the Bahujan Samaj, or the section which includes the Dalit, Adivasi, OBC or religious minorities. The next is CPIM. Now CPIM separated from CPI. So CPI was founded in 1925. Later on CPIM broke from this party and you had the formation in 1964. CPIM is Marxist and believes in the Marxist and Leninist philosophy. So socialism, secularism and democracy are the key points. It is mainly seen in West Bengal, Kerala and Tripura, and it supports the poor, factory farmers, factory workers and labourers. The CPI, that's the Communist Party of India, is opposed to the forces of communalism, and this splitted into CPIM in 1964 that we have already seen. CPI is present mainly in Kerala, West Bengal, Punjab, Andhra Pradesh and Tamil Nadu. The next important party is Nationalist Congress Party, present in Maharashtra, Meghalaya, Manipur and Assam. It believes in democracy, Gandhian secularism, social justice and federalism. So the key aspects of each party are important, and it has been founded in 1999. Now coming on to the state party, the criteria is the party should win minimum 3% of the total seats and minimum 3 seats in state legislature, should win at least 1 seat in Lok Sabha for every 25 seats, or should secure 6% of the valid votes in an election to Lok Sabha or state assembly and win at least 1 Lok Sabha seat and 2 legislative assembly seats. Finally, a recognition of state party is considered if it secures 8% of or more of the total valid votes polled in the state. Some of the common state parties are Sikkim Democratic Front, Mizo Nationalist Front and Biju Janata Dal Party. Now here you have a map of India with different state parties ruling into the different states. So that's very, very important. We have around 750 political parties that have been recognized. Now what are the challenges to the political parties? Sometimes people express dissatisfaction based on the work that the political party has been doing. There is lack of internal democracy. So the concentration of power comes in the hand of only few of the people. As a result, the party cannot maintain a kind of equity or equality among its members. The next is dynasty succession. So the son and the grandsons from the same party join the party. Money and muscle power again plays an important role in political party. Then sometimes these parties do not offer a kind of meaningful choices. For example, in Britain you have Labour Party and Conservative Party with a very meager difference between the ideologies of two, and it's mainly on the fundamental aspects that they agree, but some differences on the policy implementation that could be seen. Now when we talk about reforming a political party, defection is a major thing. So under defection what happens is, you win election from a certain party, then for money you switch on to another party. So you have the Anti-Defection Law Act that came into being. So Constitution amended the law to prevent MPs and MLAs from changing their parties. So that was the anti-defection. Then you had the law to regulate the internal affairs or the internal matters of the political party that's required, making it mandatory for 1/3 of the women to participate in the political parties, providing state funding of the elections. So all these are important. However, in certain cases, if there are over regulations, it can definitely be harmful, because when there are over regulations, it would force the parties to find alternate ways to cheat. It would also, the parties would not agree with the law that are being formed, and ultimately they are the one who would be passing the law, so they won't pass the law. So therefore, over regulation can be harmful. So whatever they don't like or they are not convinced with would not be ultimately passed. So political parties can improve if those who want to join it wholeheartedly, and it basically depends on the degree of public participation, the trust, and the level of transparency or accountability or responsibility among the citizens or the people who are joining the political parties. So it's good to have a better politics rather than a bad political party. Hello, welcome. We'll start with NCERT Class 10, the 7th chapter for Political Science. Now this chapter exclusively talks about the outcomes of democracy. In the chapters so far, we have been understanding how democracy works, what has been the scenario in India and other nations, and how these nations have tried to attain democracy over the time. So previously, many of the nations were fighting from either monarchy or dictatorship, and slowly and gradually they attained democracy. Now when we talk about the outcomes of democracy, definitely it's people-centric because people are directly involved in it. The next is, it tries to maintain the equality of the people or equality among the people, as well as it tries to maintain the economic well-being and provide freedom and dignity to an individual. Now let's have two examples. Let's say I have an example where I have Hitler as a dictator and another nation where you have democracy that is seen. Now what would happen in the two examples? In the example where you have a dictator, he has an independence to take any decision anytime he wants. So the decision making process would definitely be quick, but here it would be through negotiations, there would be arguments, disarguments, and finally the outcome would be there, and there would be certain norms which would be prescribed based on which the decisions could be taken. So definitely there is a contrast between a kind of dictatorship government or a monarchy form of government where the decisions can be much quicker, but the implementation when it comes to the common man, it might not be in favor of the common man. But for a democracy, the decisions are maximum in favor of the common man, and therefore we say it's a kind of people-centric approach. Now why we say democracy is better? So that is one thing that we have talked about. Other important things include, it provides equality to all citizens. So everyone is equal in democracy and everyone is given equal opportunities and equal rights. The dignity and the freedom of an individual is maintained. The quality of decision making definitely improves because the inputs are more. So let's say this dictator has to take a decision. He has only the ideas that are coming to his mind or to his closest cabinet, but here you would have a kind of participatory approach where lots and lots of inputs and ideas could be taken into consideration, and where you have lots of ideas that are taken into consideration, definitely the results would be much better and much people centric. Again, resolution of conflicts become much easier in case of democracy, and there is also the room to correct a lots of mistakes that are happening in reality. So democracy is good in principle, but we say it's not that good in practice. Why? Because the attainment of democracy has been different in different economic situations, different social situations. So we have seen how the things have taken place. We have talked about the countries like Nepal, where there was a third wave of independence or a third wave of democracy that was seen. So all those vary with country, with situation, but under democracy what would happen is definitely there would be elections, there would be formation of constitutions, there would be parties, and people or the citizens would be guaranteed certain rights. So those are definitely the added advantage that a democratic government witnesses. Again, if something does not work good, what happens is we try to blame the democracy or doubt the democracy. So what happens as a result is the democracy tries to achieve something and then it tries to rectify the mistake that it has already done. In a country like India, where you have a huge lot of population, the statistics reveal that the countries where dictatorship is a form of government, the economic growth is much better as compared to a democratic nation. Now, definitely this has been what has been statistically proved, but what happens when it comes to a country like India? We have a huge base of poor population that resides in the nation. Now when we have a huge base of poor population, what would happen? Since you have a huge base of poor population that is seen, these poor population or the kind of huge population that is being witnessed becomes the vote bank, and therefore the parties try to have or promote most of the ideas or most of the philosophies in favor of them. However, that should be what should happen practically, but still there are cases where this is not being taken care of and ultimately the situation worsens. Again, an important concept under governance or what we talk about democracy is the concept of art. Under art, we simply say there are three terms that we need to focus on: A for accountability, R for responsibility, and T for transparency. So those three are the basic key factors of the governance. So when we talk about good governance, we talk about that government should be accountable to the people, it should take the responsibility of the common man, and there should be transparency in the system so that whatever takes place is in the public. And a good idea for this was the RTI Act, that is Right to Information Act. So Right to Information Act would be a kind of act that would work towards bringing in more transparency into the system, because now you have the right to question why this had happened or bring out the statistics on certain events. So those are the things that we take into consideration when we talk about the governance or the government functioning. Now, definitely we have talked about how negotiations work in democracy, and democracy you have decision making that takes place through the procedure of norms. Now what are some of the good examples to examine how the decision making takes place through a standard procedure? So definitely we have free and fair elections, we have open public debates on major policies, and the Right to Information Act is one of the important acts that we discuss here. Again, democracy needs to be free from corruption. So being free from corruption is again a step towards better transparency in the system. And when you have the people who are working as a part of the government, it becomes more legitimate, you are more answerable, and people are willing to be ruled by the people from among themselves. So that's the best point of a democratic government. We have already seen how economic growth has been varying in a dictatorship nation, in a nation where there is dictatorship versus democracy. If we look onto the statistics, in the nations where there are democracy like South Africa and Brazil, top 20 people have 60% of the national income. Now this brings in huge amount of economic disparity or economic gap between the rich and the poor, which is visible predominantly in the democratic societies, and the bottom 3% is with 20% of the people. So bottom 3% of the has 20% of the population. So that's basically a big amount that we need to work around, and therefore working on economic disparities is another important issue that we need to mention under democracy, because under democracy we definitely believe in political equality, but bringing in economic equality is again important. The next important aspect is accommodating the kind of social divisions. It's very important that if a majority comes to power, this majority should not overrule the minority. So minority should be given equal representation if possible, or they should be part of the democratic setup, and once these minority are considered into the mainstream, then only we can say we have a kind of successful democracy, because a successful democracy would accommodate all the kind of social divisions that exist into the society. Again, if we see that there is someone who is being barred, then the democracy ceases to operate in that case, and we say that democracy is not accommodative for that person. So barring someone is not a correct option unless and until the person is considered medically or mentally unfit. So those are the cases we keep an exception on. The next is dignity and freedom of an individual, that we have already talked about. So every individual wants respect from others, and as a result we talk about dignity and respect and freedom as the basis for democracy. Now dignity includes dignity of women, treating them equally. Wage struggle is again important, so equal remuneration, equal wages, strengthening the claims of disadvantaged caste, and these are some of the major points that we talk about. So it's basically what makes a difference is the vote, and this vote determines what kind of government would come into action, and once the government comes into action, the concept of art comes in, that's the government should be accountable, responsible and transparent for a better functioning, and more people's participation and people's involvement would help a better government come up with more suggestions, more ideas and more creative approach.